Shabbat shalom, everyone. So the clergy of the shul, we're always talking about the tradition together. We're talking through themes in the Torah and in the rabbinic literature. And sometimes the conversations that we have suggest that we should actually present a Dvar Torah together. So Rabbi Chorny and I are honored to be together as we share a few short ideas with you that we've been thinking about throughout the week. On the one hand, the rabbis of the rabbinic tradition were very much aware of time's progression and that which came before compared to that which is now. For instance, when we read the story of Abraham greeting the three messengers or angels, depending on your understanding of the story, who are going to share the good news, the Besorot Tovot, that Sarah is to be pregnant, and they're served a combination of milk and meat, nobody bats an eye. Abraham lived before the experiences in Egypt, before the redemption from Egypt, before Mount Sinai, before the giving of the Torah, before there was any indication that Jewish tradition was going to have culture around food that would prohibit that mixture. So no one is at all concerned that Abraham wasn't keeping kosher. There was no obligation for him to. On the other hand, the rabbis love to mix up time, intentionally, with a wink in their eye. When they say ein mukdam u'mu'uchar b'Torah, that there's no chronology in the Torah, they sort of half mean it and half don't. When they imagine that Isaac invented the concept of mincha, the afternoon service, because the Torah says that he was basuach basadeh, he was meditating in the field when he was to meet Rebecca, or that Abraham invented the notion of shachari, because it says that vayeshkem Avraham baboker, he got up early in the morning before the binding of Isaac. Are they really imagining Abraham wearing tefillin and Isaac standing there reciting the Ashrei and the Amidah? I don't think so. But for them, it was significant for the biblical archetypes to be representative of the tradition and the life that they were leading when the rabbis were constructing these texts. And one of the most interesting and in some ways extreme and least likely examples of this is Esther. Esther is understood through a few pages of Talmud, Masechet Megillah, to have been the frommest woman who ever lived. Esther, the woman who is living in the palace of a non-Jewish king, is reread using kind of hints and clues in the verse of the Megillah to suggest she was basically a rebbetzin, and that she was observing all of the rules that you would imagine any righteous woman would observe. Some of that is based on the following verse, Vatitav hana'ara, that the young maiden Esther, be'einav, seemed to please the eyes of Achashverosh, Vatisa chesed lefanav, and she had a sense of grace in his presence. Vayabahel etamrukeha, the person who was responsible for this whole bizarre beauty pageant, hurried to get her the cosmetics that she needed. Viet sheva hane'arot, and the 7 maidens hari'uyotla that were appropriate for her, mi beit hamelech, from the king's house. And then a strange phrase, vayishaneha, he changed her, something like that. Viet naroteha, and her maidens, latov beit hanashim, to the positive outcome of the house of the women. On its surface, the verse suggests that Esther found favor in the eyes of Achashverosh, and the person who was responsible for this whole pageant made sure she was taken care of. But the rabbis say, hey, why is it significant to know that there were 7 maidens given to Esther? 7 is an iconic and important number in our tradition. The rabbis say it must be that she requested that. Why? She couldn't let on, of course, that she was Jewish. She couldn't let on, of course, that she had to observe Shabbat in a particular way. So she asked for 7 maidens, and she said in her head, this one is a Sunday maiden, this is a Monday maiden, this is a Tuesday maiden. And when the Shabbat maiden showed up, she knew it was time to go into the closet, light candles, say Kiddush, and observe Shabbat as it was supposed to be observed. And the phrase, Vayishaneha naroteha, that the person responsible changed something regarding how the maidens were going to respond to her. The rabbis suggest, what did they change? They changed her food, unbeknownst to the people who were actually responsible. They made sure that legumes and other vegetables that could nourish her would be given to her instead of her, God forbid, eating treif meat in the palace. To make sure that we have an image of Esther, married to Achashverosh, keeping kosher, observing Shabbat, and even referencing somewhere else in the story, having built a mikveh in the palace so that she could immerse in it according to the laws of immersion in the mikveh that had not even yet been written.
So when we read these verses from the Talmud, which come hundreds and thousands of years after we received the Megillah, this Megillah that we'll read in just a few days for the holiday of Purim, we see an issue. We take issue with this notion that there might be in here a perversion of the text, of the plain text itself. It's the kind of thing that historians take issue with all the time. I read an article from History, as in the History Channel and all the things that have spun off from it, in which 8 historians were interviewed. I selected a particularly pithy quote from one of the historians who was interviewed, Jonathan Clark, who was quoted as saying, "Present-centered judgment, which some will call presentism for short, is so widespread that it can easily be made to look respectable. Polite dissent from this new orthodoxy is convincingly depicted by presentists as moral partisanship on the wrong side. So presentism must be pushed to its logical conclusion before derision can open the way for historical research." You can imagine how this is wielded politically. You can imagine in today's American landscape how this might erupt into argumentation. But here, we're using this idea to talk about the challenge that our Talmudic rabbis give over to us in reading Esther's text. The Esther that they hand over to us in Masechet Megillah, in our Talmud, is not the Esther that we see when we read the plain text of the Megillah scroll itself, or when we hear it twice on the holiday. Instead, our forebears create this Nida, observant, Torah, kind of centric and kosher-keeping and Shabbat-counting Jewess. They create a wildly revisionist sense of Esther. And I think it's because they're deeply uncomfortable. Why? Because who was Esther actually, and where was she living actually? She was, in the plainest read of the text, a product of a deeply assimilated Persian Jewish culture. It was post-Second Temple, that's not right. Post-First Temple, pre-Second Temple. Comfortable with the notion that she would climb to a place of authority by entering a beauty pageant in which she would become queen of a non-Jewish king through intermarriage. Reading God and Halakha back into Megillat Esther is an anachronism that might make the rabbis, it maybe makes some Jews more comfortable, but it makes me uncomfortable because it doesn't hold the characters in honest context. And clearly, it's clearly not the only way to read the Megillah. It's clearly not the only way to read the Megillah text. There are plainer, simpler ways for a Jew to read the text.
There are a lot of issues with the holiday we're about to celebrate with great joy and frivolity. In some communities throughout history, there's been abuse of alcohol in the attempt to kind of fulfill the notion that we're supposed to drink so much that we no longer make a distinction between Haman and Mordechai. That's a dark side of this holiday. The end of the Megillah is hard to read if you really read the verses carefully. Right? A Jewish community that didn't only defend itself, but went on a vengeful warpath, a bloody one, that we read through quickly, but it's part of the story that's presented to us as holy. And even the core characters can be challenging to a particular mindset about what a Jewish hero and heroine is. I had a cousin that I've spoken about from the Bima several times. His name was Dr. Yisrael Eldad. He was sort of the Zionist patriarch of our family. He was my grandmother's first cousin, which seems like a very far distant cousin, but was central to our family narrative. His grandchildren and I are third cousins. We're still very much in touch. Our children are now fourth cousins, and that relationship is very significant. He grew up in Poland. He got a rabbinical degree in Vienna, and then came to Palestine in the 1930s with his best friend, a man by the name of Menachem Begin. And when they got to pre-state Palestine, they each did their own work in helping the state come to be. He was a learned, passionate, profound Zionist. He hated the holiday of Purim. He was an observant Jew. Not an Orthodox Jew per se, but an observant Jew. He really had a hard time with Purim. Why? Because number one, it lifted up as hero and heroine some of the most clearly assimilated Jews in our biblical tradition. Mordechai, as many of you know, has become quite a wonderful Jewish name. Mordechai has as its origins not Hebrew, but probably some Babylonian or Sumerian relationship or reference to the god Marduk. Calling your child Mordechai back then was calling your Jewish child according to the name of a pagan god. Esther, another beautiful Hebrew name now, is not originally a Hebrew or Jewish origin name. Esther's probably related to Ashtarti, which was a Syrian fertility god. She had a Hebrew name, Hadassah, but she also had a local name attached to a heathen god. And most painful for my cousin Eldad, if you try to historicize the story of Purim and put it exactly where it's supposed to be in history, it takes place after King Cyrus, the Persian king, defeated the Babylonians, who had brought the Jews into exile from the land of Israel, and allowed the Jews to go back. Many Jews did because they've been waiting for 70 years. We sat on the waters of Babylon and we cried. We have an opportunity to go back to the land of Israel, let's go. Some stayed. Which Jews stayed? Probably the Jews who were comfortable and assimilated and were naming their children after local gods. So according to my cousin Eldad, this is a holiday that venerates assimilation so much that your names become interchangeable with the local culture, and anti-Zionist, which I know was an anachronistic concept back then, because you had a community that could have been living out their lives in the land of Israel as the community was gathering again to build a second temple, but chose a comfortable, diasporic, assimilated life without fulfilling their destiny of living life in the land of Israel. That's in some ways like us. Yeah. And that, to him, was what made it hard for him to celebrate the holiday as lifting up Mordechai and Esther as hero and heroine. But even if we do read them as accurately as that, maybe it's possible to see them as specifically heroic and role models for us.
So we both went to the Jewish Theological Seminary. We are both students of history, and we're both students of Torah. We both want to read the Megillah in its historical context. We're both going to celebrate Purim this coming week, somewhat with reticence, but that has nothing to do with our discomfort with the historicity of the Megillah or not. But how does one celebrate, run towards the holiday of Purim if you want to accept the truth that in fact it really is a book without the name of God and is really a book about a community that's living a comfortable, assimilated life in Persia? I think that the answer comes out of the very conversation in the Megillah that we're calling into question, and it comes from the character that you say is named after the god Marduk. Mordechai, we can talk about that argument later. You see, there's this line in the Megillah that says that Mordechai is Asher Hagla Mirushalayim. The Mordechai is one of the generation and one of those who made Yerida, as we call it today, who left Jerusalem to come to the community in Persia, where he eventually becomes caretaker to Esther. And the story goes from there. Rava, one of the teachers in the conversation in the Megillah, says, this line comes to teach us, why tell us that he comes from this place, that Mordecai comes from this place? The wording itself, which the Tosafot, by the way, say we don't pronounce as but read as hugla, Rava says it's shegala me'atzmo. He made the choice to leave Jerusalem, to leave Yerushalayim, and to go to Persia. Why'd he go? Why'd he leave Jerusalem? If he was comfortable, and if he was, as we see the Megillah itself make it out to be, the kind of guy who sat at the gates tearing his clothing when he heard the news that the Jews were in trouble, if he was in fact pious in that way, what was he running away from and what was he running towards? Remember that he was part of the generation of the Jews who knew from the ashes of the first temple. He was running towards the smoke that told of the flames of anti-Semitism. He came from a community in Jerusalem that knew from the destruction of the first temple. He left Jerusalem going into exile of his own accord because he had work to do, he had life to live, he had a destiny that he was meant to fulfill, and that destiny was not Keruv. It was not to go out and convert assimilated Jews to be from Jews, to be more religious Jews. It wasn't because, as we have accounts of, like with Yonah, with our prophets in the past, that some prophets were driven to cry out to the people that they should return and they should repent and they should be good Jews again. That's not the Mordecai that we read in our story. He ran towards the threat of anti-Semitism. He ran towards the worry that the destiny of the Jewish people is to constantly be driven to the edge of destruction, and that it is our responsibility to rise up and to fight against it. He ran towards the worry of more ruination. He pushed Esther towards that intermarriage. He is a survivor of the first Eicha generation, warning and pleading for the first time, never again. And he understood something that we understand today, even if we don't always say it out loud, which is that the destruction of an assimilated Jewish people is just as terrible as the destruction of a pious Jewish people. Our enemies certainly don't differentiate and never have. So what do we do with our Megillah? Well, we're commanded to hear it twice on Purim. And the most interesting version of this story is having to hear it in its plainest text itself and contend with it over and over again in its most raw and terrible and wonderful and joyous and complicated form twice each year. Remembering that the story is perennial, that the heroicism present in the story is to run towards a community in need, to run towards those that we love, and that the story of turning things upside down in Purim is one of believing deeply that our Jewish communities are tied wherever they're found. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.